23 women quit in 2 years. 23. But it wasn't until I heard my own daughter whisper, "Papa doesn't love us like Mama didn't," that I realized I was the one who needed to be fired. My name is Daniel Reed. I own a fashion empire worth $47 million. I dress celebrities. My designs walk runways in Paris, Milan, New York. Magazines call me a genius. But I couldn't keep a single nanny for more than 3 weeks. Everyone blamed my daughters. 3 little girls who supposedly terrorized every woman we hired. They're manipulative, people said. Spoiled rich kids, they whispered. Impossible to handle. But here's what no one understood. Here's the truth that almost destroyed me. My daughters weren't trying to scare people away. They were asking one question that I was too afraid to answer. Will you stay or will you leave us too, just like everyone else? And the most painful part? They were asking me that question most of all. This is the story of how I almost lost everything that mattered, and how a woman I barely knew saved my family by telling me the one truth I didn't want to hear. Let me take you back to where it all began. Welcome to the story room. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you about a man who had everything, yet nothing at all. In the heart of Paris, there stood a beautiful mansion. Marble floors that shined like mirrors. Crystal lights that sparkled like stars. Rooms so big your voice would echo if you called out. This mansion belonged to Daniel Reed, a famous fashion designer whose name appeared in magazines across the world. But here's the thing about big houses. They can feel very, very small when the people inside are hurting. Daniel had 3 daughters. Sophia, Emma, and Little Rose. 3 beautiful girls with the same dark hair and the same sad eyes. Their mother had left 2 years ago. Just packed her bags one morning and never came back. Since then, Daniel buried himself in work. Fashion shows in Milan. Business meetings in New York. Design studios that needed his attention more than his daughters did. Or so he told himself. The girls? They stopped crying for their mother after the first year. They stopped asking when Daddy would come home after the second. Instead, they learned something else. They learned to test people. To see who would stay and who would leave, just like everyone else did. Nanny after nanny walked through that big front door. And one by one they all walked back out. Some lasted a month. Some barely made it through a week. The girls never screamed. They never threw tantrums or broke things. No, they did something much harder to fight. They simply watched. They waited. And they asked quiet questions that cut deeper than any tantrum ever could. Will you stay when things get hard? Do you really care about us? Or are you just here for the money? Daniel told himself it was bad luck. Wrong timing. The nannies just weren't good enough. But late at night, when he walked through that silent mansion, he knew the truth. His daughters weren't pushing people away for fun. They were protecting their hearts from breaking again. 23 nannies in 2 years. 23 women who arrived with hope and left with exhaustion. Daniel stood in his hallway one evening, and for the first time in months, he really looked at his daughters. Sophia, the oldest at 9, sat on the grand staircase reading a book. But her eyes never moved across the pages. Emma, 7 years old, hummed a song their mother used to sing. But she hummed it so quietly, like she was afraid someone might hear. Little Rose, only 5, drew pictures on the floor. Pictures of 3 girls standing alone. No adults in her drawings. Never any adults. Daniel's chest felt tight. When did I become a stranger in my own home? The latest nanny had quit that morning. A kind woman from Belgium who cried as she left. "I'm sorry, Monsieur Reed," she had said, shaking her head. "Your daughters, they don't need a nanny. They need their father." The door closed. The words stayed. That night, Daniel hired someone new. A woman from a small agency. Her name was Grace Holland. Her resume was simple. No fancy schools. No long list of rich families she'd worked for. Just one line at the bottom that caught his eye. "I understand children who have been hurt." He didn't know why, but something about those words stuck with him. The girls didn't know Grace was coming. Or maybe they did. They always seemed to sense these things. Sophia tapped her fingers on the table. Emma watched the door like a cat watching a mouse. Rose drew another picture, this time of a door with a question mark above it. Daniel looked at his daughters and felt something break inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack, like ice beginning to melt. Please, he thought. Please let this one be different. But even as he hoped, a voice in his head whispered the truth he'd been avoiding. The problem isn't the nannies. It never was. Grace arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. No bright smile. No cheerful voice. No promises about how everything would be wonderful now. She simply knocked on the door, stepped inside, and said, "Hello, I'm Grace." The girls stared at her like judges in a courtroom. Sophia's eyes narrowed. Emma crossed her arms. Rose hid behind her sisters, peeking out with careful eyes. Most nannies would panic at this point. They'd talk too much, trying to fill the silence. They'd pull out gifts or games, trying to win the girls over quickly. They'd make promises. "We're going to have so much fun together," or "I'm going to take such good care of you." Grace did none of that. She looked at each girl, really looked at them, and then she sat down on the floor. Right there in the grand entrance hall, on the cold marble floor, she sat. And she waited. The silence stretched out like a blanket, heavy and thick. Daniel watched from the doorway, holding his breath. He'd seen this moment before. This was when the girls would start their tests, when they'd see how long it took to make the new nanny uncomfortable. But Grace didn't squirm. She didn't check her phone. She didn't try to force conversation. She pulled out a small sketchbook from her bag and started drawing. Simple lines. A tree. Birds. A bench. She drew like she was alone in a park, peaceful and calm. Curiosity won. It always does with children. Sophia stepped closer first. "That tree has no leaves," she said. It was a challenge, not an observation. Grace looked up and nodded. "Maybe it's winter," she said simply. "Or maybe they'll grow later." Emma sat down next. Then Rose. No words yet. Just watching. Over the next few days, the tests began. Sophia hid Grace's keys. Emma asked the same question 17 times in a row. "When are you leaving?" Rose stared at Grace during meals, unblinking, until most adults would look away. Grace never got angry. She never pretended not to notice. When Sophia hid her keys, Grace said, "I guess I'll walk today." When Emma asked when she was leaving, Grace said, "Not today." 17 times. And when Rose stared, Grace stared back gently and said, "I see you too, little one." Days turned into a week. Grace ate what the girls ate. She sat on the floor when they played. When Daniel came home late from a fashion show in London, she stayed without complaint. No sighing. No watching the clock. No asking when he'd be back. Then one evening, something happened that changed everything. Daniel came home to find the girls laughing. Real laughter. The kind that fills a room and makes the walls feel warmer. He stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to breathe, afraid the sound would disappear if he moved. Grace was teaching them a clapping game, and she was losing badly. On purpose. Everyone knew it. That made it even funnier. Later, after the girls went to bed, Grace said something to Daniel that he would never forget. She said it quietly, like she was sharing a secret. "Your daughters aren't trying to scare people away," she told him. "They're trying to see who stays." She walked away before he could respond. Daniel stood there in his expensive hallway, surrounded by designer furniture and original paintings, feeling more exposed than he'd ever felt in his life. Because he knew she was right. And worse, he knew she was talking about him too. 3 weeks after Grace arrived, Daniel's world cracked open. It was late evening. The girls were asleep upstairs, curled together in Sophia's bed like they still needed each other to feel safe. Daniel sat in the kitchen, pretending to review fabric samples, really just talking to himself in his head like he always did. Grace walked in and asked a simple question. "May I tell you something?" Daniel nodded, though his throat felt tight. She told him about her own childhood. Simple words. No drama. She grew up in a small apartment in Dublin. Her father worked 3 jobs. Her mother died when she was young. She learned early that people leave, even when they don't want to, even when they love you. That's why I don't make promises I can't keep, Grace said softly. That's why I just show up. Every day. Even when it's hard. Then she said the words that broke him. Your daughters don't need someone to save them, Daniel. They need someone who shows up. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Daniel looked down at his hands. These hands sketched beautiful dresses. These hands built a fashion empire worth millions. But these hands had rarely held small ones. Had rarely braided hair before school. Had rarely wiped away tears. I worked for them, he said, his voice rough. Everything I did was for them. Grace's eyes were kind but honest. Then why don't they believe that? Before Daniel could answer, a small voice came from the doorway. Papa. All three girls stood there. Sophia in front, Emma and Rose behind her, holding hands. They'd been listening. How long had they been there? The room felt too small and too big at the same time. Daniel stood up slowly. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. I'm sorry. The words sat in his throat like stones. Sophia looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. You're always working, she said. Not angry. Just true. We thought you didn't want to be with us. Like Mama. Those words hit harder than any business failure ever had. Emma's lip trembled. Rose's eyes filled with tears. And Daniel felt something inside him shatter completely. No, he said, his voice breaking. No, that's not. I'm so sorry. He knelt down, right there on the kitchen floor, and opened his arms. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rose ran first. Then Emma. Then Sophia, slower, more careful, but she came. They crashed into him like waves, and he held them tighter than he'd ever held anything in his life. I'm sorry, he said again. I'm so sorry. I thought providing for you was enough. I thought if you had everything, you'd be okay. But I was wrong. You don't need things. You need me. Sophia's voice was muffled against his shoulder. We just want you to stay, Papa. We just want you to stay. In that moment, Daniel understood what he'd been missing. His daughters had been testing every nanny. But really, they'd been testing him. Asking the same question over and over in 100 silent ways. Will you stay? Will you see us? Will you love us more than your work? Grace stood in the doorway, smiling softly. Not the smile of someone who won. The smile of someone who understood. She quietly left the room, giving them space, giving them time. That night, Daniel tucked all three girls into bed for the first time in months. He read them a story. He kissed their foreheads. He promised something simple and true. I'll be here for breakfast. Such small words. But they meant everything. 6 months later, the mansion felt completely different. Same marble floors. Same crystal lights. Same expensive paintings on the walls. But everything had changed. Daniel woke up to the sound of laughter floating up the stairs. Real, loud, unafraid laughter. He smiled before he even opened his eyes. In the kitchen, chaos greeted him. The good kind. Sophia was showing Grace how to fold napkins into swans. Emma was pretending to be a master chef, making pancakes that looked terrible but tasted like love. Rose was dancing around the table singing at the top of her lungs. Grace was right in the middle of it all, flour in her hair, laughing as Emma's pancake landed on the floor. Daniel stood in the doorway, just watching, his heart so full it hurt. This is what I was missing. This. He didn't travel as much anymore. He turned down fashion shows if they fell on the girls' school events. He came home for dinner. He helped with homework. He sat on the floor and played games where he lost on purpose, and everyone knew it. The girls stopped testing people. They stopped watching the door like they expected everyone to leave. They stopped whispering at night about who would abandon them next. They learned to trust the day, to trust tomorrow. One afternoon, Sophia looked up from her book and said something that made Daniel's eyes burn with tears. Papa, Grace can't leave, right? He smiled. She's not planning to. And neither am I. Grace never asked for more money, never asked for praise. She simply gave what mattered most. Presence. Being there. Staying there. Showing up every single day. Daniel still designed clothes. He still ran his business. But now he understood something he'd missed for years. Success isn't measured in fashion shows or magazine covers. It's measured in moments. In laughter over breakfast. In bedtime stories. In 3 daughters who finally felt safe enough to just be children again. One evening, he stood in the same hallway where he used to feel so alone. Where he used to talk to himself about all his failures. But this time, he wasn't alone. Rose ran past him, chasing Emma. Sophia called out, "Papa, come play with us." Grace walked by, carrying laundry, and gave him a knowing smile. Daniel looked around his mansion and finally understood what a full house really meant. It wasn't about the number of rooms. It wasn't about how big the space was or how expensive the furniture. A full house meant full hearts. It meant people who stayed, who showed up, who loved you even when you messed up. His daughters hadn't been driving nannies away because they were bad children. They'd been brave enough to test love until it proved itself real. And him? He'd learned the hardest lesson of all. Money builds mansions. Time builds families. The richest thing Daniel owned wasn't his fashion empire. Wasn't his name in magazines or his designs on runways across the world. It was 3 daughters who laughed freely again. A home that finally felt warm. And the simple, beautiful truth that the best thing you can give someone isn't things. It's yourself. As he joined his girls in the living room, sitting on the floor surrounded by board games and snacks, Daniel smiled. The mansion was the same. But everything had changed. Because finally, truly, he was home. Thanks for your watching. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the Story Room for meaningful stories that inspire and teach life lessons.